I remember hoping for and advocating for a language change when I was in my 20s. And I think the thing that makes it different is that I was hoping for, I wasn't the first by any means, but I was hoping to add something to the repertoire rather than restrict or take something away, which is to say Ms., the honorific Ms., MS period. Because, and everyone who's thought about this knows why, but because Mr. exists as an honorific that doesn't specify anything except the sex of the person, the fact that they're an adult. It's a man. It's an honorific for a man that doesn't imagine anything else about him, whether or not he's a doctor, whether or not he's married, whether or not he's anything, right? Whereas there was no, until Ms., there was no honorific for a woman, that is to say an adult human female, that didn't inherently specify whether or not she was married, Mrs., or not married, Miss. And so there was no equivalent. You had Mr., and so Mr. versus Mrs. or Miss tells us that the language as it existed without an honorific for women that didn't specify whether you were married or not, that somehow being married was a fundamental thing that you needed to know about a woman. Yep. And so Ms. seemed, and still does seem to me, to fill a gap that was necessary and that revealed past sexism in the language.
Well, I think actually there are two structural differences that argue in favor of this one as an actual remedy.
Mm-hmm. And as an addition as opposed to a taking away.
You weren't arguing that nobody should be allowed to say Mrs. or Miss about themselves.
Sure, of course not.
Right. So the point is there are contexts in which women were not common or found at all, that women gained access to, in which their marital status was specifically not relevant, right? And so the idea that men had a term that didn't convey this piece of information because in a business context or scientific context it was completely irrelevant, means that having access to a neutral term that does not convey availability as a fundamental is valuable. So in effect, what you had is the previous state of the language was a form of compelled speech, right? You had to convey marital status because you didn't have an option that didn't contain it. You either conveyed it incorrectly, right? You could use Mrs. if you weren't married, right? Nobody can stop you from doing that. But then the point is that conveys a false piece of information, right? Yeah. So the idea that the past version was coercive, maybe in a past world, it made sense to allow that because this piece of information was relevant in all contexts. Who knows? But in a liberated world where women are participating fully in these venues where marital status is utterly beside the point, you need that equivalent term. And so adding to the language, giving an option that is neutral and not compelling the conveying of a piece of information that's irrelevant, both seem to me to change this. But it is the very rare example of a linguistic change that actually solves a problem, solves an actual problem.
A linguistic change that is explicit and sort of hoped for, right? Like that's
It
because language evolves. Language generally doesn't get changed from on high like this. This misunderstands how language changes. With each generation we have new phrases, new ways of using words, and other words and phrases or meanings fall out of use, and that is what happens. And there will always be someone who says, "Oh, I missed that thing," or "I really want this," or like, "How could we be, abusing the language this way?" Like, okay, we can get riled up about all these things, right? But that is what happens to language. Whereas this, you can't do that. Like, that's not how this works. And sometimes there can be a recognition, like with Ms., of, we're actually missing a word.
Yep.
Our language is missing a word, and here we go.
Yeah, actually, you know what? That's another really good point, is that I'm drawing it too cleanly, where language evolves, we agree on this, but architected changes are almost never a good idea, right? That's not true if
new words come into being all the time.
And they are often architected or have to be architected because you've done something technically new, right? Like, I'm sure the term electronic did not exist. Right. Electric existed. There were lots of motors and things, but then electronic had to be invented as a term that connoted something beyond that, some kind of processing.
Right.
And so anyway, when you are involved in the production of some new capacity or technology or observation of some pattern, the ability to
Or
say,
if you're literary, like, I mean, Shakespeare brought how many words into language, right?
I don't know, but it's a
Yeah,
lot.
a lot.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. But I guess the point is, when there's something that new that needs to be said and you don't have a word for it, architecting a word that conveys it as well as possible is a good thing. When you are trying to force a change onto language that is already adequate to convey everything you've got, wow, no,
Yeah.
it's not the remedy.